The Terran-Vasudan alliance, hastily formed and driven by conflict, is starting to disintegrate. Power, like nature, abhors a vacuum. And history has shown that in these situations, fortune always favors the bold.
The Great War has ended, but the price of victory was almost unbearably high. Vasuda Prime was a cratered graveyard. Earth and the Sol system have been cut off from subspace, leaving the Terrans without their homeworld and government. Worse, despite the loss of their super destroyer, the Lucifer, the Shivans still roam the stars, preying upon the sentient peoples of known space. While it seemed they had become dispirited and unorganized with the loss of their flagship, the Shivans were very much still an active threat. Attempting to maintain at least a semblance of order in this new universe, the Galactic Terran Alliance sets up a provisional government in Delta Serpentis. However, maintaining order among the traumatized human populations is a daunting task. It is only due to the GTA's military that their authority is recognized, but their grasp on the new order is still tenuous at best. Compounding matters was that relations between the Terrans and Vasudans were slowly deteriorating. The alliance formed by the two races in the face of their extinction seemed less necessary with the destruction of the Lucifer. As well, grudges and beliefs developed through 14 years of propaganda and warfare between the two races began to reassert themselves. In the midst of all this was Galactic Terran Intelligence, GTI, a branch of the GTA focusing on, you guessed it, providing information regarding the enemies of humanity by whatever means possible. This organization was subdivided into 3 groups based on their role in the field of intelligence. These divisions being Strategic Assault and Containment, also known as Special Operations, Intelligence Gathering and Espionage, and Research and Development. An important note about GTI in regards to the Hades Rebellion was how it was structured. Each division had their own fleet for their operations and would report to a single command fleet that both worked directly with GTA leadership and coordinate operations between each group. However, with the horrific losses incurred during the Battle of Deneb, which involved the loss of their command ship, the GTD Legion, the GTI divisions were forced to decentralize, placing them under the direct authority of GTA High Command. While they did take orders from the GTA, in reality each division essentially acted on their own. Oversight on Terran intelligence was presumably limited, as the Alliance was barely keeping the Terran worlds together while attempting to push the Shivans out of their space at the same time. These circumstances would be the ideal environment for one GTI General Andreas Ryback. Along with Admiral Marcus Glaive and his Research and Development Division, now was the most opportune time to set into motion their plans for the future of the human race. However, not all of GTI were aware, or even a part of what Ryback was planning, chiefly among them being the Special Operations Division, led by Admiral Scott aboard the GTD Krios. Special Ops had continued in their core mission of fighting the Shivans and upholding the Terran-Vasudan Treaty, all the while oblivious of what was to come. Of late, however, the pilots of the Krios couldn't help but notice strange irregularities in their missions. It all began when Krios pilots participated in a joint operation with Vasudan intelligence, where they were tasked to protect a science convoy from Shivan attackers, while moving through Vasudan territory that was supposed to be off-limits to the Terrans. At first the mission went as predicted. Occasional Shivan assaults on the convoy were rebuffed easily by the Allied defenders. But during the mission, a group of Shivan fighters jumped in several kilometers away from their position. The pilots were content to ignore them until they got closer to the convoy. However, a Terran science vessel from GTI R&D, the Einstein, began pleading for help over the comms, as those Shivans the pilots noted earlier began attacking them. Questions as to why an unauthorized Terran vessel mysteriously appeared in their space immediately came forth from the Vasudans. But Terran Command was forced to delay answering that question in order to focus on saving the Einstein. Unfortunately, the Einstein was destroyed by the Shivan marauders before the Terran fighters could intercept, but her escape pods were able to launch and jump out of the area to relative safety. Alpha and Beta wings were reassigned from their previous charge of convoy protection to the new task of tracking down the escape pods and safeguarding them from the Shivans. as the convoy was already heavily protected by their combined turret screen, and with new fighters from the Krios en route to them. The Vasudans believed they could part with their Terran allies so that they could go after the pods, while not sacrificing their own security. Jumping to where the escape pods were, the two flight wings were greeted by the Einstein survivors. The pilots quickly took up escort formation, as the Shivans, true to their nature, returned to finish off the survivors, but their newfound sense of lethargy and disorganization since the loss of the Lucifer was no match against the Terrans. The Shivans would continue to return at random intervals afterwards, but each time they failed utterly to reach the pods. Eventually, the GTD Repulse jumped into the area, claiming they were assigned to retrieve the Einstein survivors. But another jump portal opened, carrying the GTD Krios, having been assigned by Terran Command to retrieve the pods. Communications between the two ships were heated. Neither Admiral Scott aboard the Krios nor Admiral Glaive aboard the Repulse seemed ready to back down from completing their mission. Meanwhile, the Einstein pods were still unsure which ship was supposed to receive them. So, one pod went with the Repulse, while the other went with the Krios. This seemed to satisfy Admiral Glaive, who afterwards ordered his ship out of the area, but he promised Admiral Scott that he would get to the bottom of this incident with Terran Command. What just happened was a very curious occurrence, as the Repulse was stationed all the way in Antares, so for them to be assigned to a rescue operation in Deneb was quite unusual. Then there was the question of the Einstein. What was a Terran science cruiser from GTI R&D doing in a region of space forbidden to the Terrans? In addition, another mystery would arise when the Krios pilots were being debriefed. The Vasudan convoy they were previously escorting was completely annihilated by the Shivans, which seemed to make no sense as 1. The convoy was heavily protected by the turret screen on their own vessels, combined with the fighter reinforcements sent by the Krios, and 2. The new lethargy permeating the Shivan species meant their own fighting effectiveness would not be able to prevail against the defenders. So could they really have had the ability to destroy the convoy? But there was little time to dwell on this strange turn of events, as the GTA and Parliamentary Vasudan Empire were gearing up for a final push on Ross 128, the first system to fall to the Shivans. Recent offenses by both fleets had resulted in the Shivans being kicked out from Vasuda, Deneb, Sirius, Vega, Betelgeuse, Alpha Centauri, Aldebaran, Regulus, and Ikea. Ross 128 was the last Shivan stronghold. Crushing them there would end the Shivan menace for good. In order to ensure the greatest chance of victory, Special Ops fighters from the GTD Krios would jump in advance of the fleet to conduct reconnaissance of the Shivan force composition around the Ross 128 jump node. The first ones selected to charge into the unknown were the 91st Phantoms, designated Alpha Wing. However, when they jumped into the system, there were no Shivans. Instead, 2 Terran cruisers and their fighter escort were engaged in recovering Shivan wreckage. Not wanting the GTA to know of their existence, they immediately attacked Alpha Wing as they attempted to scan and identify the cruisers. Fortunately for the GTA, Alpha Wing managed to get out intact with their unusual findings. When the data from the recon mission in Ross 128 was corroborated with Allied records, it was found that the 2 Terran cruisers were the Odin and the Thor, officially listed as missing in action. The most likely explanation was that some renegade element of the GTI pulled these ships from active duty to have them recover Shivan wreckage, undisturbed by the GTA command hierarchy. But yet again, there was little time for further investigation, as the final offensive in Ross 128 began to fully take off and deliver results. Led by the renowned GTD Bastion and PVD Pinnacle, both fleets made considerable gains quickly, so much so that the road was swiftly laid bare to the SD Archon, the last Shivan destroyer overseeing command and control of the system. The flight wings from the Krios were given the honor of this knockout blow, but the first stage of the attack would involve bombers from the GTD Repulse, bombarding the area with the new EMP missiles, a weapon that when unleashed would disable all electronics within their blast radius. Once the bombers finished, the Krios pilots would move in and gun down anything that glowed red. Unlike every other time when an unproven technology failed at the moment they were needed most, the EMP missiles were a phenomenal success against the Shivans, who were utterly at the mercy of the GTA. Good thing that after months of horrific warfare, they had none to spare. as the Archon exploded in a beautiful display of pyrotechnics, and the pilots exchanged promises of how much they were going to drink in celebration when they got back. The bombers from the Repulse had returned to the battle, with command not able to be reached for some mysterious reason, and the bombers not responding to their inquiries. The Krios pilots proceeded to jump out, just as the Repulse pilots launched their EMP missiles. If they had delayed for but even a second longer, they would have been caught in the blast wave and met the same fate as the Shivans. But things were taking another, unexpected turn for the worse. As the Krios fighter wings came out of subspace, they returned to find their mothership under attack from GTI bombers. Her attempts to call for help blocked by nearby GTI science cruiser jamming all transmissions out. Unfortunately, the Krios had already been heavily damaged, and despite the spirited defense from the returning fighters, the Krios soon erupted into a fireball. The only survivors of the destroyer were those who managed to evacuate in the ship's escape pods beforehand. Realizing they needed to quickly even the odds, the Krios planes moved to destroy the science cruiser, and soon after, a desperate plea for help from the survivors reached the GTD Soyokaze, another GTI destroyer loyal to the Alliance. Quickly arriving on the scene, the Soyokaze and the Krios pilots were able to wipe out the GTI traitors. Once everyone was aboard the Soyokaze, there was finally time to piece together the utterly unexplainable turn of events instigated by those rogue GTI elements. In the eyes of the traitors, the Krios was considered a threat due to their recovery and interrogation of the Einstein survivors back in Deneb, where the crew of the science vessel stated that GTI most likely knew of the existence of the Shivans well before the attack on Ross-128, and subsequently moved to list several Terran science vessels as missing, so they could observe these aliens without Alliance interference. The destroyer would only grow as a threat in their eyes when her pilots stumbled upon the GTI recovery operation at the eve of the Ross-128 offensive. As the Krios and her crew had inadvertently caught themselves in two separate, off-the-books operations by Terran intelligence, it would only have been a matter of time before the Krios could potentially expose their operations by putting the pieces together. Fortunately, or unfortunately, as the bulk of Terran and Vasudan forces would be engaged with the Archon and the remaining Shivan forces in the system, an opportunity presented itself to the GTI, so that they could rid themselves of the meddlesome destroyer while no one was looking. The loss of the Krios could presumably be explained away as a last-gasp Shivan surprise attack, and Terran intelligence could have continued their inscrutable plans in secret. And I would have gone away with it too if it weren't for those meddling pilots. With the silent threat of galactic Terran intelligence now exposed to the universe, GTI was forced to immediately accelerate their plans into open rebellion. All ships under the Research and Development Division began rallying at two systems, Delta Serpentis and Beta Aquila. The Alliance, in turn, declared all GTI ships hostile, with the remnants of the Special Ops and Intelligence divisions being folded into the regular GTA battle group, which included the Soyokaze. Fortune seemed to favor the GTA, as their scouts quickly found the Repulse, the flagship for the GTI R&D division, still under command of Admiral Marcus Glaive. The destroyer was found at a remote location in Delta Serpentis, orbiting a dry dock of unknown configuration. Hoping to seize the initiative and deal a crippling blow to the GTI rebellion before it can reach full strength, Terran Command orders the Soyokaze and her pilots to capture this flagship. The plan involved having the GTC Adamant jump into the area of operations to offer Admiral Glaive the chance to surrender, but while the two ships would be conversing, Soyokaze pilots would jump in from behind and sneak up to the Repulse and disable her engines, thus preventing the destroyer from escaping. The plan went off without a hitch. Mostly. The rebels put up a fierce resistance but were inevitably outfought by the tenacious loyalists of the GTA. Even though Admiral Glaive discreetly escaped in the chaos of battle, the Alliance still had the Repulse, her crew, and eventually, many of the GTI's precious secrets. But the GTA could not stop here, for there was one more target they needed to hit first. Jotunheim Station, the headquarters for the entirety of Galactic Terran intelligence, located in Beta Aquila. Unwilling to lose the offensive momentum they had, both GTA and PvE fleets would again strike while the iron was hot. The plan was to engage GTI forces all throughout Beta Aquila in the hope that the Allied fleet's advantage in sheer numbers could overwhelm the rebels, paving the way for the destruction of Jotunheim Station. However, unlike the attack on the Repulse, Jotunheim Station would be where the GTI would play its trump card. At first, the attack went successfully. Fighters from the Soyokaze engaged the defenders and cleared the way for Terran and Vasudan bombers, from the GTD Intrepid and the PVD Vanguard respectively. But once the Alliance destroyed Jotunheim's defense forces, the station's commander, and the man who orchestrated the GTI conspiracy, General Andreas Ryback, made an open broadcast to the GTA vessels. In his transmission, Ryback stated that GTI's projections gave the Terran Alliance only 2 years before it would crumble under itself, and that only Galactic Terran intelligence had the means and power to restore order among their worlds. When challenged by Alliance command, Ryback continued by saying the partnership between the Terrans and Vasudans was a sham that would only last until the Vasudans had the power to stand on their own again, and that if one race was to be destroyed, then GTI would make damn sure we're the ones alive at the end. Ryback then made an impassioned plea to the GTA pilots, saying that command was throwing away the lives and sacrifices of their comrades made in the 14-year-long Terran-Vasudan War. That last sentence was the tipping point for Zeta Wing, the Terran bomber squadron from the Intrepid. Remembering the bloody conflicts of the war and the loss of his fiancée aboard the GTD Eisenhower, Zeta 1 began challenging command's orders, pointing to the Vasudans' own history of backstabbing and treachery within their politics. Afterwards, Zeta 1 took his wing and defected to the GTI on the spot. Suddenly faced with an insufficient amount of firepower to bring against the installation due to the loss of half their bomber complement, the Allied pilots pressed on regardless. Eventually, GTA and PvE cruiser reinforcements arrived, and soon after the Jotunheim would go up in a glorious fireball. The rebellion was now well and truly crushed. But GTI was nowhere near out of the game just yet. As the last embers of the Jotunheim faded into the void of space, an enormous jump portal appeared nearby, and an unknown destroyer-sized ship had come through it. Compounding on the mystery of this ship was that its electronic signature was giving off both Terran and Shivan readings. But that wasn't the only surprise. Only a few seconds after it appeared, a Shivan beam shot out from the destroyer and annihilated a nearby Vasudan cruiser in one blast. Quickly realizing their inability to counter this unknown Leviathan, Allied forces had to beat a quick retreat. GTI would make sure to put this new power to good use. Almost as if in revenge for the loss of the Jotunheim installation, the Hades moved on to annihilate several Allied strongholds throughout both Beta Aquila and Vega. Seemingly nothing could stop this unholy fusion of Terran and Shivan technology. Stymied at every attempt to respond to the Hades through brute force, GTA Command resorts to an old tactic that helped give them the edge against Lucifer: a recon mission. A pilot from the Soyokaze, designated Alpha 1, would jump near the Deneb subspace node where the Hades was located. From there, they would get in close and scan each critical subsystem on the super destroyer in an attempt to find a weakness. Of course, sending a lone ship was practically suicide, but more importantly, all but guaranteed failure. To give Alpha 1 the highest degree of success, 2 other wings, Beta and Gamma, would fly interference. As well, a single Terran science vessel, the Herschel, would be on station to collect the findings gained from Alpha 1. But events would take a turn for the completely unexpected. Again, Alpha 1 did manage to get the scan data from the Hades and have it transmitted to the Herschel. However, Command ordered the Allied forces to stay in the area to analyze the jump data from the Hades as it proceeded through the subspace node to Deneb. This delay allowed them to witness the arrival of the PVD Hope. When questioned by Terran Command, the Vasudan admiral aboard the Hope replied that they would avenge themselves on the GTI, and that survival must come second to victory, warning the Terran pilots to get clear. What the admiral was referring to was their first engagement with the Hades, although it was not known as that at the time. After the capture of the Repulse, the super destroyer ran the Beta Aquila blockade back in Delta Serpentis, cutting through the Hope and her escorts like a hot knife through butter. An untold number of Vasudan lives were lost, with the survivors deeply traumatized, most likely due to seeing another great destroyer as described in their prophecies. Presumably the tragedy of that dark day burned in the memory of the Vasudan admiral, committing himself to what was to happen next. With a final cry of "Sa Vasuda!" The Hope opened a subspace portal in the path of the Hades and rammed the super destroyer at full speed. The lives and crew of the renowned Vasudan ship ending in a blinding flash of light. And yet, the Hades still stood, intact, and preparing to jump to Deneb. Terran Command, the Herschel, and the Soyakaze pilots were all flabbergasted. The Hades took a whole Vasudan destroyer right on the chin and was still operational. With nothing left, the Terrans withdrew, hoping that maybe something, anything, could be found to finally kill this monster in Alpha 1 scan data. While analysts were eagerly tearing apart the findings from the Hades, GTA Command had finally finished their interrogation of the Repulse's crew, and the dissection of their computers. With it, they were finally able to piece together why the bulk of Galactic Terran intelligence just decided to up and break away from the Alliance. It all started in 2324, when Terran analysts concluded that the Terran-Vasudan War would not be won in a matter of months with the methods available at the time. Galactic Terran intelligence, however, was undeterred by this. They immediately made plans for a super destroyer that would be almost invulnerable to any form of attack, be it from fighter, bomber, or capital ship. The next year, GTI would begin work in the Delta Serpentis shipyards on Project Hades, their name for this audacious plan to ensure Terran supremacy amongst the stars. By 2335, the Hades was nearing completion, just as the Shivans became known to the GTI. Realizing the importance of studying their advanced alien technology for integration with the Hades, research and development began putting forth considerable resources to the study of these new invaders, even going as far as to falsify casualty reports so that their ships and personnel could operate outside the GTA hierarchy. Once the Shivan beam weaponry was integrated into the Hades, all Galactic Terran intelligence had to do was wait for the go-ahead to launch. But that order was never given, so the question became, why did GTI instigate this rebellion in the first place? The answer was simple. Over the course of the Great War, through their collaboration with the Vasudans, the GTA had lost its way, from their point of view. With the destruction of the Lucifer and the sealing of all nodes to Sol, their analysts predicted that the Alliance had a mere 2 years before it fully collapsed in on itself. Then there was the issue of the Vasudans. Far too many in the GTI did not believe that the spirit of cooperation between the two races would hold, and the old Terran-Vasudan War would begin again once the Vasudans had the power to do so. If humanity was to survive, Galactic Terran intelligence had to take the lead, so they began to position themselves to overthrow the provisional government, dissolve the Terran-Vasudan Treaty, and wipe out the Vasudans once and for all to secure the future of the Terran people. In light of these revelations, it came as no surprise as to why many GTA officers and pilots had defected to the GTI once they had been exposed. 14 years of continual war, tragedy, and sheer horror had embedded itself in the attitudes of many, making the Terran-centric principles of the GTI quite appealing. As the Hades was traveling through Deneb, the super destroyer was forced to make an emergency stop at an abandoned supply depot over the planet of Deneb 3, as the damage from the Hope's kamikaze run had returned, manifesting itself through critical engine failure. Fully willing to take advantage of the situation, GTA Command surmised that this was the one and only shot they had to destroy this nightmarish behemoth. Taking on the super destroyer required two things: firepower and the incapacitation of its beam weaponry. The Hades was not invincible, but its armor plating was thick enough to require the firepower of an Orion, combined with the usage of a full bomber complement to do any reasonable damage against it. Under regular circumstances, anything in the capital ship weight class would be obliterated long before the Hades so much as received a dent, but the Hades' newfound lack of mobility was the edge the GTA needed. The plan was to use the Soyakaze, as they were the only destroyer in range, and have one of their bomber squadrons disable the 5 beam cannons of the Hades, at which point the Soyakaze herself could jump in and engage the super destroyer with at least some degree of success. Timing was critical. From the scans of the Hades, it was found that its engines were enhanced with Shivan technology, which meant it could use subspace nodes that regular Terran or Vasudan ships could not. With this in mind, GTA analysts believe that the Hades would use the unstable Deneb Altair jump node to exterminate the Vasudans in the Altair system before moving on to do the same in Aldebaran. Allied forces would be forced to take a much longer route through Alpha Centauri, but by the time they would reach the Hades, there would be nothing left of the Vasudans but ashes and rock. The Hades had to be stopped here. Failure was not an option. The Soyokaze bombers jumped in and worked their magic in disabling the Hades beam cannons, which proved to be a far less daunting task than originally assumed. Once they were taken care of, the Soyokaze jumped in and began pounding away at the super destroyer. But it soon became evident to the Alliance that this was going to be a long-term slugging match. But fortune would smile upon the Soyokaze and the GTA. A Vasudan admiral named Amenhotep aboard the PVD Guardian contacted the Soyokaze, telling them of a Terran cruiser called the Orf, which was sent into Deneb to join the fight with the Hades. However, a GTI sympathizer gave them the wrong coordinates, and the Orf found itself ambushed by the Hammer of Light, the rebel Vasudan group that aligned themselves with the Shivans. Fortunately for the cruiser, fighters from the Guardian found them and drove off the attackers. And now, Amenhotep was offering both the services of his planes and the redirection of the Orf to their battle with the Hades. Admiral Tess aboard the Soyokaze gratefully accepted. And once the reinforcements arrived, the battle began to turn in favor of the Alliance. Inevitably, in a combined, almost superheroic push, the Hades was obliterated, and with it, the threat of the GTI. Despite their intention to cause division and conflict, GTI's actions had only served to bring the two former enemies closer together. In the end, with their one chance of Terran supremacy broken, the remaining forces of the GTI surrendered. The Terran and Vasudan races saved from being plunged into another bloody war so soon after the end of the last conflict. Unfortunately, their predictions about the GTA collapsing were inevitably proven true. The Hades Rebellion in retrospect serves as the catalyst for the eventual fragmentation of the Terrans into independent governing blocks, after a period of economic and political turmoil. But what couldn't be predicted by GTI was that a union between the Terrans and Vasudans would be formed by 2345, where one-time enemies would travel the spaceways side by side as allies and true friends. However, one man, a former officer in Galactic Terran intelligence, had come across GTI's old research about a potential Shivan communications device. But such a device was far from finished, and it could take years, decades even, to build the infrastructure needed for further research and development. But he would not be deterred, and this man would eventually go on to change the face of the galactic landscape forever.